I'm looking at a Toyota service bulletin that acknowledges what many Prius owners had been quietly noticing. The engine drinks more oil than its mileage suggests it should, and the reason isn't a defect. It's the math of how a hybrid drivetrain actually works. The document on my screen uses careful language, the kind manufacturers use when they want. To be honest, without alarming anyone, and it talks about acceptable oil consumption rates on the 2ZR FXC Atkinson cycle engine that you'll find in second, third, and fourth generation Prius models. What's buried in that paperwork, and in the change from 5W30 to 0W20 that Toyota quietly rolled out, is a story about engineering, physics, and a service interval most owners are getting wrong without ever realizing it. Stay with me, because what's hiding inside that TSB explains a lot. Here's the situation as it actually exists in driveways across the country. A Prius owner pulls up to 15,000 miles, the maintenance light glows on, and they head in for what the manual still calls a standard oil change interval. The technician drains the oil, and it comes out darker, thinner, with a faint smell that isn't quite right. A warm, slightly sweet note that sits at the edge of fuel. The dipstick, checked a week earlier at home, read low. Not catastrophic, just lower than the owner remembers it being. They top it off, they shrug, and they figure the car is fine because the Prius reputation is essentially unkillable. And in many ways, it is. But that reputation has masked a quieter problem that's been there from the start, and it's a problem that doesn't show up on a mileage gauge. It shows up on the calendar. The stakes here matter more than people think. We're not talking about a catastrophic failure event. We're talking about long-tail wear, the kind of slow degradation that can cause oil consumption to creep upward, that can lead to ring seal issues over years, and that some owners report as a gradual climb from a quarter quart between changes to a full quart, then a quart and a half, then enough that they're adding oil monthly. The 2ZR FXC is a tough little engine. It's also an engine being asked to do something no continuous running motor has ever been asked to do, and the service interval most owners follow was written for a world where engines run continuously. That mismatch is the hidden issue. Let me tell you what makes this TSB worth paying attention to. Toyota's acknowledgement is unusually direct. The bulletin language doesn't argue that consumption is impossible or abnormal. It sets out a range of acceptable consumption and quietly tells the field that earlier generation Prius owners may show higher numbers than later cars. That's a meaningful admission from a manufacturer that historically defends its powertrains with the patience of a stone wall. Independent hybrid technicians, the kind who specialize in Toyota and Lexus hybrid systems and who've torn down hundreds of these engines, have been saying the same thing in shop forums and technical seminars for over a decade. The pattern they describe is consistent. City-driven Priuses, the cars used for stop-and-go commuting, show oil that looks darker than mileage alone should produce, and they show wear patterns that don't match what you'd see on a highway-driven engine of the same age. Pay attention to this number, because it's the heart of the whole story. A traditional car starts its engine once when you turn the key, runs it continuously until you arrive, and shuts it off. One start, one warm-up, one shutdown. A Prius, in city traffic, industry data and hybrid powertrain analysis suggest the engine can start and stop somewhere between 30 and 150 times in a single 1-hour drive cycle, depending on traffic, terrain, climate control demand, and battery state of charge. Let that sink in for a second. The engine you'd start once in a Camry, you're starting potentially 100 times in a Prius, and each one of those starts is a coldish start where the oil hasn't had a chance to do everything it's supposed to do. Here's where it gets interesting. The technical term for what happens during a cold start is fuel dilution. When an engine first fires, the fuel injectors deliver a slightly richer mixture because cold fuel doesn't atomize as cleanly. A portion of that unburned fuel slips past the piston rings, the thin metal seals at the top of each piston, and ends up in the oil pan below. In a normal car running continuously, the oil heats up to around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and that small amount of fuel cooks off and evaporates out through the crankcase ventilation system. Picture warming up dinner in a microwave. Except you pause the microwave 30 times in 15 minutes and call that a complete heating cycle. The dinner never gets evenly hot. In a hybrid, the oil often never reaches that fuel evaporating temperature, especially on shorter trips and in cooler weather. The fuel stays in the oil. It accumulates, it thins the lubricant. That's the real-world consequence. Your oil isn't quite oil anymore, it's oil plus gasoline, and it lubricates less effectively while it sits there. Why does this matter? Because thin, diluted oil is more likely to be consumed by the engine, more likely to be pulled past worn rings into the combustion chamber, and more likely to leave deposits on ringlands. Those little grooves where the rings sit. Over time, deposits can stick rings in place, ring seal can degrade further, and consumption can climb. It's a feedback loop. It starts with the math of the hybrid drive cycle itself. Most people don't know this, but the 2ZR FXE isn't a standard Ottocycle engine. It runs the Atkinson cycle, which is an engineering compromise that trades peak power for thermodynamic efficiency. The intake valves stay open slightly longer during the compression stroke, which means the engine effectively has a shorter compression and a longer expansion, squeezing more work out of every drop of fuel. That's wonderful for efficiency. It's part of why a Prius gets the mileage it does. But the Atkinson cycle also runs cooler than a conventional engine of the same displacement, and cooler combustion plus shorter run times plus frequent restarts equals the perfect environment for fuel dilution to accumulate. The engine is brilliant at saving gas. It's also vulnerable in a way nobody really talks about to the very driving pattern it was designed to thrive in. The piston ring design is the next layer. Toyota's engineers, recognizing that this engine would face unusual thermal cycling, used relatively low-tension rings to reduce friction and improve fuel economy. Think of a rubber band wrapped around a soup can. A tight rubber band seals well but takes more force to pull along the surface. A looser rubber band moves more freely but doesn't seal as completely. Low-tension rings are the looser rubber band, and on a hybrid that experiences hundreds of expansion and contraction cycles per drive, that looser seal can let more combustion blow by slip past, which means more contamination in the oil and slightly more oil getting past the rings into the combustion chamber. The trade-off was deliberate, and on highway-driven hybrids it works beautifully. On city-driven hybrids in cold climates, the math gets harder. This part will make you pull your Prius dipstick this weekend. Because the kicker, the thing nobody warned you about when you bought the car, is that the engine in a hybrid spends an enormous percentage of its operating time in what mechanics call the warm-up phase. On a continuous running car, the warm-up phase lasts maybe 5 minutes, the time between cold start and the oil reaching its full operating temperature. After that, the engine spends 95% of the trip at full thermal operation. On a city-driven Prius, the engine may start, run for 45 seconds while you accelerate from a stoplight, shut off when you coast, restart for another minute, shut off again, and on and on. The engine may never spend more than a few continuous minutes at full operating temperature during an entire commute. As one veteran hybrid technician put it, the engine started cold 100 times before it ever fully warmed up. That's not a poetic exaggeration. That's a description of the actual thermal history of a city-driven Atkinson hybrid engine on a winter morning. And that's not even the worst part. The hybrid system makes its own decisions about when to fire the engine, decisions that don't always align with what would be best for engine lubrication. Cabin heat demand will start the engine even when the battery has plenty of charge. Battery state of charge management will start the engine to spin the motor generator and charge the pack. Catalyst warm-up cycles will keep the engine running briefly to maintain emissions, equipment temperatures. All of these triggers can result in short engine run cycles where the engine fires up, runs for 30 to 90 seconds, and shuts back down before the oil ever sees real heat. Multiply that across a 15,000-mile interval, and you're looking at thousands of partial warm-ups, every one of them depositing a little more fuel into the oil, every one of them aging the lubricant in a way that mileage alone doesn't measure. Wait until you see how the consumption numbers stack up. Some owners report typical consumption in the range of half a quart to a full quart between 5,000-mile services on second and third generation Prius models. And that's the consumption that falls inside what Toyota's bulletin characterizes as within normal range. Translate that across 15,000 miles, and the owner who doesn't check the dipstick is potentially running on 2 to 3 quarts low by the time the maintenance light comes on. The 2ZR FXE holds about 4.5 quarts of oil total. 2 quarts low is roughly 40% of total capacity. The oil that's left is older, more concentrated with contaminants, and working harder than it should ever have to work. Picture a swimming pool that loses water gradually over the summer. By August, it's not really a pool anymore. It's a shallow basin where everything that fell into it all summer is now floating at higher concentration. Your oil pan goes through the same thing, just on a smaller scale and a faster timeline. Now let me play devil's advocate, because there's a counterview that deserves a fair hearing. The hybrids are bulletproof position isn't wrong. Prius engines routinely run past 200,000 miles, 300,000 miles, and in some documented cases, past 500,000 miles. Fleet data from taxi companies in cities like Vancouver and New York shows Priuses outlasting essentially every conventional fleet vehicle they've been compared against. If oil consumption were a serious threat to engine longevity, you'd expect to see waves of failed Prius engines, and that's not what the field data shows. The engines mostly run and run and run. So if you're sitting there thinking, my Prius has 200,000 miles and I've never done anything special, and it's still fine, you're absolutely correct. And that experience is shared by millions of owners. But here's the nuance. The cars that survive longest are usually the ones driven longest distances, highway commuters, rideshare drivers covering hundreds of miles a day, Vehicles where the engine reaches full operating temperature regularly and stays there. The cars that show problems earlier are typically short-trip city cars, the ones that never get a chance to fully warm up, the ones doing a 5-mile round trip to the grocery store twice a day. The bulletproof reputation is real, and so is the failure mode I'm describing. And they aren't contradictions, they're two ends of a usage spectrum. Where your car sits on that spectrum determines which story applies to you. There's also a separate, related issue worth knowing about. The change from 5W30 to 0W20 was a deliberate engineering decision Toyota made for the later Prius generations, and it had real benefits. Better cold start lubrication, slightly improved fuel economy, faster oil flow to critical components on those frequent startups. The 0W20 oil is thinner at room temperature, which means it gets to the cam bearings and valve train within fractions of a second after a cold start, reducing the wear that happens during those brief moments when metal touches metal before oil pressure builds. That's a genuine improvement for a hybrid duty cycle, but thinner oil also has slightly less film strength under load, and that becomes relevant if you've allowed your oil to become contaminated and overaged. A thin, fuel-diluted oil is even thinner than it should be, and that compounds the problem if you stretch intervals too far. So here's the resolution, the practical part. You can actually act on this week. The frame I want you to use isn't miles, it's months. If you drive primarily city miles, if you take short trips, if your daily drive is under 15 minutes one way, your oil is aging on a calendar more than on an odometer. Industry data and hybrid technician consensus suggests that for short-trip city-driven hybrids, a 6-month change interval matters more than a 5,000-mile interval. If you hit 6 months and you're only at 3,000 miles, change the oil anyway. The contamination from fuel dilution, moisture condensation, and combustion byproducts has been accumulating regardless of how few miles are on the odometer. If you drive primarily highway miles, if your commute keeps the engine fully warm for half an hour or more at a stretch, you have more flexibility. You can probably run closer to the manufacturer mileage interval safely because your oil is reaching the temperature where fuel evaporates out and combustion byproducts cook off. But even then, going beyond a year without an oil change isn't wise. Oil is a chemistry product, and additive packages degrade with time as well as with heat exposure. If you've never checked your oil between services, and most Prius owners haven't, because the maintenance reminder system creates an illusion that the car will tell you when something's wrong, start checking it monthly. Park on level ground, let the engine sit for at least 10 minutes after shutdown so the oil drains back to the pan, pull the dipstick, wipe it clean, reinsert it fully, pull it again, and read the level. If it's near the lower mark, top it off proactively with the correct grade of oil. Don't wait. Letting a hybrid engine run a quart low for thousands of miles is asking the oil that's left to do the work of oil that isn't there anymore. If you smell that faint, warm oil note after a city commute, that slightly sweet, slightly fuel-tinged scent when you pop the hood, that's a sensory cue worth respecting. Hybrids develop that smell more than continuous running engines because of the dilution mechanism we've been discussing. It doesn't mean anything is broken. It does mean your oil is doing harder work than the calendar reflects. If your dipstick reads darker than you'd expect for the mileage, trust your eyes. Oil that looks ink black at 3,000 miles in a city-driven hybrid is telling you something the mileage gauge isn't. That oil has cycled through hundreds more cold start events than a comparable conventional car, and it's carrying the residue of every one of them. If you have a second, third, or fourth generation Prius, and you've been stretching to 15,000 mile intervals because that's what the maintenance minder suggests, consider this your nudge to recalibrate. The maintenance minder is a useful tool, but it doesn't know how many engine starts you've accumulated, it doesn't know your drive cycle profile, and it doesn't know whether your oil has been quietly thinning with fuel for months. You know those things. Let your knowledge override the algorithm when the situations call for it. The physical action this week is simple. Pop the hood. Find the oil dipstick. It's the yellow handle on the 2ZR FXC, easy to spot. Pull it, wipe it, reinsert, pull again. Look at the level, look at the color. If the level is low, top it off with the correct grade. 0W20 for the 2010, and later cars, 5W30 for the older second generation, though many owners have transitioned older cars to 0W20 as well. And Toyota has accepted that transition in the field. If the color looks dark and you can't remember when you last changed it, schedule the change now rather than waiting for the maintenance light. Take 10 minutes this week. That 10 minutes can add years to the back end of your engine's life. If you've been hearing that distinctive Prius engine note when the battery is low, the soft hum and rumble of an Atkinson engine waking up at a stoplight, that quiet rise and settle as it kicks in and warms up the catalyst, start counting how many times you hear it on your commute. Not to be obsessive, just for awareness, most owners are stunned when they actually count. The engine you thought ran briefly is running far more often than you realize, and every one of those moments is another short cycle in the long story of your oil's life. What you've just learned isn't in the owner's manual in those terms. It's scattered across service bulletins, technician forums, hybrid powertrain seminars, and the accumulated experience of mechanics who've spent decades inside these engines. The Prius is a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering. The TSB FXE is an engine that, treated with even modest awareness of its actual duty cycle, can run essentially forever. Treated like a conventional engine on a conventional service schedule, it can still run a long time, but it won't be operating at its best, and the slow drift of consumption and contamination can eventually catch up with it. The TSB exists because Toyota knew. The change to thinner oil exists because Toyota adapted. The piston ring design exists because Toyota engineered for efficiency at a calculated cost. And the 6-month oil interval, the monthly dipstick check, the proactive top-off, those exist because owners and technicians figured out the gap between what the manual says and what the physics demands. You can close that gap in your own driveway with 5 minutes of attention. The Prius isn't fragile. It's just being asked to do something profoundly unusual. And the service practices that protect it best are the ones that account for that unusual duty cycle rather than treating it like every other car on the road. If you take one thing from this conversation, let it be this. Watch the calendar, not just the odometer. Check the dipstick, not just the maintenance light. Trust your nose and your eyes when something seems different. And when in doubt, change the oil. It's cheap insurance against a long, quiet, expensive problem. If this changed how you think about hybrid service intervals, hit subscribe. More hybrid deep dives coming.